Hello and welcome back to A Level Biology Help. Today I'm going to take you through the nutrient cycles section for AQA A Level Biology. Also, near the end of the video I will be going through a few exam style questions and explaining their mark schemes. And as always, I'll be putting timestamps in the comments section so that you can skip to the different parts of the video if you do not wish to watch the whole thing. Right, so let's get started. So this is the content that we are going to cover today. First, I'm just going to give you a small introduction to nutrient cycles. Then we are going to talk about mycorrhizae, then the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, fertilizers, and then how that can lead to the process of eutrophication. Right, so let's begin. So, nutrients need to be recycled within natural ecosystems in order to build important organic materials, so like DNA, ATP, etc. Microorganisms, so bacteria, play a vital role in recycling chemical elements such as phosphorus and nitrogen. These are the two most important chemical elements that are recycled. The main type of microorganism that we are going to focus on are called saprobionts, which are sometimes bacteria or sometimes fungi. The bacteria that are saprobionts are often called saprobiotic bacteria. So saprobionts are organisms that digest their food or their nutrients externally, so they don't digest them inside their own bodies, and then they absorb the products. So here we have an image of a fungi, and that would be an example of a saprobiont. Now there are many adaptations to saprobionts and plants, so the relationship between plants and so for example fungi that help in the recycling of nutrients. One adaptation are mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae are fungal associations between plant roots and fungi. Mycorrhizae provide a large surface area for uptake of water and inorganic ions, so phosphates and nitrates. Mycorrhizae act like a sponge, so they can absorb and hold onto water and minerals easily. This is advantageous in extreme environmental conditions. So here we have a nice image of mycorrhizae. So as you can see, they are very extensive and have a large surface area. So they provide a connection or an association between plant roots and fungi. So plant roots and fungi have a kind of relationship. This is known as a mutualistic or symbiotic relationship. This is because the plant provides the fungi with carbohydrates, whilst the fungi provides the plant with water and inorganic ions. So they both benefit each other, so a mutualistic relationship. Right, so now we are going to talk about the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is necessary as it recycles nitrogen from the atmosphere as it is needed to create DNA, RNA, amino acids, ATP, etc., etc., as nitrogen is a vital component in all of these substances. So there are four main steps to the nitrogen cycle: nitrogen fixation, ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification. So we're first going to focus on nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is when nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen, so N2, to ammonium ions, so NH4+. Now, you do not need to know the names of the particular nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So this is the equation that we use. So atmospheric nitrogen, if I just get my pen tool out. So atmospheric nitrogen, N2, gets converted by nitrogen-fixing bacteria into ammonium ions, NH4+. Now, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are either free-living in the soil or they have a mutualistic relationship with leguminous plants, so clovers and beans, as they can live in their root nodules. So they're either free living in the soil or have a mutualistic relationship with legumes because they live in their root nodules. So now I'm going to talk about the next process, which is ammonification. Ammonification is kind of similar to nitrogen fixation in that ammonium ions are also produced. However, the ammonium ions in ammonification are produced from organic nitrogen. This organic nitrogen comes from the decomposition of proteins, DNA, urea, ATP, etc. So they are converted to ammonium ions, which are then released into the soil. So ammonium ions are now free in the soil. This is carried out by saprobionts, which we mentioned earlier. So these are bacteria and fungi that can digest waste extracellularly. This means that they secrete enzymes that allow this. So here I just have an image of a leguminous plant. I think it's a rhizobium, which has lots of root nodules, which are kind of these ball-shaped structures on the roots. So these are the root nodules, which can house nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Right, so the next stage is nitrification. Nitrification is when ammonium ions produced by ammonification and nitrogen fixation in the soil are oxidized, the key term here is oxidized, to nitrites, then nitrates, and this is carried out by nitrifying bacteria. Again, you do not need to know the specific names of these bacteria. So this is the equation. So your ammonium ions, so NH4 plus, get converted to nitrites, which are NO2 minus, and then oxidized again to NO3 minus, which are nitrates. And it is important to know that this is a two-stage oxidation reaction. So the final step in the nitrogen cycle is denitrification. Denitrification converts nitrogen in the compounds, so the nitrates, back to nitrogen gas. So it is a cycle, as nitrogen gas is used in the first step. So, however, if we just click on, denitrification is not as useful, so it is a limiting process as nitrogen gas cannot be absorbed by plants. So only nitrates can be absorbed by plants. So denitrification can be a disadvantageous process. And denitrification is carried out by anaerobic denitrifying bacteria. So denitrification happens a lot in anaerobic conditions, which is one of the reasons why farmers often have to aerate their soil so that denitrification is limited. So now I'm going to move on to the phosphorus cycle, which is kind of similar to the carbon cycle, which you might have studied at GCSE. So phosphorus, in the same way as nitrogen, is essential to form DNA, ATP, RNA, but also phospholipid bilayers to form the cell membrane. So this is the first step in the phosphorus cycle. So environmental factors or conditions, for example erosion and weathering, caused by things such as rainfall, cause the release of phosphate ions by rocks into soil and bodies of water, so rivers, ponds, lakes, etc. Plants in the soil or aquatic plants in the bodies of water assimilate, which is another word for take in, these phosphate ions. So the phosphate ions are used by the plants to synthesize DNA, ATP, etc. The third step is that animals, so consumers, eat the plants, and then they use the phosphate ions to synthesize organic materials, so your ATP, your DNA, phospholipid bilayers, etc. Then these animals eventually die and decompose, which returns phosphate ions back to the soil. Bacteria in the soil, so your saprobionts, break down the phosphate ions into inorganic forms of phosphate, which is called mineralization. Then these inorganic forms of phosphate or phosphorus can then end up in waterways again and be assimilated by plants. Inorganic phosphate ions can often end up in waterways through rainfall as it causes them to be washed into the waterways. So they can be reused again and again. So to sum up, erosion and weathering causes a release of phosphate ions. The plants then take these ions in. Consumers eat the plants, then use the ions themselves. The animals then die and decompose, which returns the phosphate ions to the soil. Bacteria break down the phosphate ions into inorganic phosphoruses. Then these inorganic phosphorus molecules can then end up in waterways and be assimilated again by plants. So this leads me on to fertilizers. Fertilizers are extremely important as they replace the nitrates and phosphates lost by harvesting plants and removing livestock. The demand for fertilizers is increasing rapidly as the global population increases, so demand for plants and livestock increase rapidly for food sources. So there are two types of fertilizers that you can get: natural fertilizers and artificial fertilizers. So first I'm going to talk about natural fertilizers. Natural fertilizers can be manure, seaweed, peat, guano, etc. So they come from natural sources. So manure comes from the excrement of animals, seaweed from the ocean, peat from the decomposition of plants, and then guano, which is the excrement of seabirds. The advantages of natural fertilizers are that they are cheaper and they are free if they come from your own livestock. So they are free if they come from your own livestock, as you do not have to get them from a further outside source. However, the main disadvantage of natural fertilizers is that the exact amount of minerals or proportions of minerals cannot be controlled. Right, so let's now talk about artificial fertilizers. So these come from artificial sources, so they are not natural. The main advantage of artificial fertilizers are that they contain the exact amounts of minerals, so that you can use different amounts of the fertilizer depending on how much nutrients you need or minerals you need. Also, they are more water soluble, so more ions, say phosphates and nitrates, dissolve in the water surrounding the soil, so there is a higher absorption of inorganic ions. So obviously the more water there is, the higher chance that these will work. However, the main disadvantage to artificial fertilizers is that they can lead to leaching and eutrophication if there is rainfall. So what is leaching? Leaching is when water-soluble compounds, so your phosphates and your nitrates from your artificial fertilizers, are washed away into bodies of water, for example rivers and ponds, which is often caused by flooding or rainfall, heavy rainfall. If nitrogen fertilizers leach, eutrophication can occur. So what is eutrophication? Eutrophication is when you leach nitrates in the bodies of water, cause algae growth on the surface. So algae are a type of organism. So here we have a body of water which looks like a small lake or a pond, which has algae growth on the surface, denoted by the green colour on the surface. So you've probably seen a body of water that has been taken over by algae before. But this is a disadvantage, as the excessive algae growth blocks light, so less light can penetrate into the water as the algae growth blocks it. This means that aquatic plants below the surface can't photosynthesize as less light is reaching them. This means that they die, as they can't carry out the light-dependent reaction. If you haven't watched my video on photosynthesis, please go check that out now in the corner. So the next step is that aerobic bacteria, so bacteria that require oxygen to survive, feed on the dead plant matter that has died due to lack of photosynthesis. And these aerobic bacteria respire aerobically. This uses up a lot of the oxygen in the water. This is bad as fish and other aquatic organisms die due to lack of oxygen, I mean. So this is bad, so the main result is that fish and other aquatic organisms die because the aerobic bacteria feed on the dead plants, which obviously requires them to respire aerobically. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen, so the aerobic bacteria use up all the oxygen, so that fish and other aquatic organisms can't respire efficiently, so they die due to lack of oxygen. Right, that is it for the content, and now I'm going to take you through some exam questions. So if I just get my highlighter tool. The diagram shows part of the nitrogen cycle. So here we have nitrogen gas converting to ammonium ions and then nitrates. Which one of the processes P, Q, or R involves nitrification? So nitrification, as we said earlier, is when ammonium ions are converted to or oxidized to nitrites and then nitrates. So if we look at the diagram, the letter that denotes the conversion of ammonium ions to nitrates is R. Often diagrams don't include the nitrite stage, it just says ammonium to nitrates. So we can say that the answer is R. So the answer is R by the mark scheme, so we would get that mark. Let's look at the next part of the question. The diagram above includes one process in which microorganisms add ammonium ions to soil. Describe another process carried out by microorganisms which adds ammonium ions to soil. As this is a describe question, you just need to write down what happens, not why something is happening. So this is what I've written. So this is basically describing the process of ammonification. As the question is asking you what adds ammonium ions to the soil, and as I said earlier, this is ammonification. So proteins, or you could write amino acids or DNA, are broken down to ammonium ions by saprobionts. It is essential that you write saprobionts here. So let's look at the mark scheme. So you can write proteins / amino acids are broken down to ammonium ions or ammonia, so we would get that mark. Notice the part that says to ammonium ions / ammonia is in brackets, so you do not need to write this to get the mark. Also it says except nucleic acid / RNA / DNA / urea or any named nitrogen containing compound as an alternative to protein or amino acids. Also it accepts saprophytes and saprotrophs. So the second marking point says by saprobionts or saprobiotic microorganisms. We wrote saprobionts, so we would get the second mark. So we would get both marks of the question. It says neutral decomposers, so they don't really want you to put that. They want you to refer to saprobionts. However, they reject answers where incorrect type of bacteria given as saprobionts, for example, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria don't have anything to do with ammonification. So if you wrote something to do with nitrogen fixation, you don't get any marks at all for the question, even if what you wrote for the first marking point was correct. Right, so let's move on to the next part of the question. So it says denitrification requires anaerobic respiratory conditions. Ploughing aerates the soil. Explain how ploughing would affect the fertility of the soil. As this is an explain question, you need to justify what you're putting. So as I said before, ploughing aerates the soil, so it adds oxygen to it. This means that the anaerobic bacteria that carry out denitrification can't function properly. So this would increase the fertility of the soil as there are more nitrates present in the soil. So this is what I've written. Ploughing would increase fertility as there would be an increase in nitrates due to less denitrification. So let's look at the mark scheme. The mark scheme says, so the first marking point says fertility is increased as more nitrate is formed or less nitrate is removed or broken down. We wrote there's an increase in nitrates, so we would get that mark. Also they accept nitrate remains. So the second marking point says less/no denitrification/process P is decreased/fewer denitrifying bacteria. We wrote less denitrification, so we would get both marks for this question. Also, it accepts more nitrification/more nitrifying bacteria/process R is increased. So let's move on to the last part of the question, I think. So one farming practice used to maintain high crop yields is crop rotation. This is not on the syllabus, but questions involving crop rotation allow you to apply your knowledge to different farming practices. So this involves growing a different crop each year in the same field. So we can highlight that. Suggest 2 ways in which crop rotation may lead to higher crop yields. As this is a suggest question, it requires your own ideas or your own knowledge applications. So as you're growing different crops, this means that different crops have different nutrient requirements, which would be beneficial. So different crops use different nutrients. Obviously, you don't need to explain your answer as the question doesn't say explain. And the second point I put is that crops containing nitrogen-fixing bacteria can be grown. This is essential as this is the first step in producing nitrates. So let's look at the mark scheme. So the first marking point says you can grow crops or plants with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which we wrote, so we would get 1 mark. Also, it accepts grow legumes/named examples, e.g. peas, beans, clover. It accepts fallow year. So you need to write the word fallow here if you want to write this point, as it is underlined. Also, it accepts use different amounts of ions or nutrients. So you can put these to get the mark. The second marking point that you could write is different crops use different minerals/salts/nutrients/ions from the soil. We wrote different crops use different nutrients, so we would get both marks for this question. Another point that you could write is that different crops have different pests or pathogens or diseases. But as the question says 2 marks, if you put all 3 of these marking points, you don't get 3 marks. You can only get a maximum of 2 marks for this question. So let's move on to this question. Upwelling is a process where water moves from deeper parts of the sea to the surface. So we can highlight deeper to the surface. This water contains a lot of nutrients from the remains of dead organisms. Nitrates and phosphates are 2 of these nutrients, so as I mentioned earlier. They provide a source of nitrogen and phosphorus for cells. Give a biological molecule that contains 1 nitrogen and 2 phosphorus. This is a pretty easy question. So nitrogen is a component in amino acids, DNA, ATP, etc. So you can write any one of these. So I've written amino acids, as nitrogen is a component in the amine group, and also in the R group of some amino acids. Phosphorus is a component of DNA, as nucleotides contain a phosphate ion. So let's look at the mark scheme. So you can put, for nitrogen, you can put any one of these. I'm not going to read them all out as there is a lot of them. And for phosphorus, again, you can write any one of these. Also, it says for mark point 1 and mark point 2, accept any named equivalent examples, for example, nucleotides, as nucleotides contain both nitrogen and phosphorus. However, here it says neutral ammonia/nitrite/nitrate/phosphate. So the examiner doesn't really want you to write that, as they are not very useful biological molecules. It is nitrogen and phosphorus that are essential. So let's move on. Describe the role of microorganisms in producing nitrates from the remains of dead organisms. So this is asking you to write about the process of nitrification. So, well, to get the nitrates, obviously you need to have the ammonium ions, and to get the ammonium ions you need the process of ammonification. So it is not asking you to write about nitrogen fixation, as the question says, from the remains of dead organisms. So it is wanting you to get your answer from organic nitrogen. So this is what I've written. Saprobiotic microorganisms, or bacteria, break down dead material from plants and animals into ammonium ions. Ammonium ions are then oxidized to nitrites, then nitrites, then nitrates by nitrifying bacteria. So I've referred to saprobiotic microorganisms and nitrifying bacteria, as in the question it asks you to refer to the role of microorganisms. Again, I haven't really justified my answer, as the question only says describe. So let's look at the mark scheme. So the first marking point is saprobiotic microorganisms or bacteria break down remains or dead material / protein / DNA into ammonia / ammonium. So we would get that mark. It also accepts saprobionts, saprophytes, and saprotrophs. However, neutral decomposers say they don't really want you to write that. They want you to refer to a saprobiotic microorganism. So the second marking point says ammonia / ammonium ions are converted into nitrite and then into nitrate. So we would get that mark as well. Also, it allows you to write the chemical symbols, so the equations. Also, it accepts the correct answers which use incorrect bacteria, for example, nitrogen fixing, but then reject in mark point 3. So if you refer to nitrogen fixing bacteria in mark point 3, you don't get any marks at all for the question, even if you got mark point 1 and 2 correct. Right, so this basically means that you can refer to nitrogen fixing bacteria in mark point 1, but not in mark point 3, otherwise you don't get any marks for the question. So mark point 3 says by nitrifying bacteria or nitrification, but I would prefer if you wrote nitrifying bacteria, as the question is wanting you to refer to the role of microorganisms, so bacteria. So that's 3 marks. So this is the last question that we're going to look at today. It's a pretty easy 2-mark question. So upwelling often results in high primary productivity in coastal waters. So I talked about primary productivity in my video about energy and ecosystems, which you can check out in the corner if you haven't watched that already. So the question says, explain why some of the most productive fishing areas are found in coastal waters. So as this is an explain question, you need to justify your answers. So this is what I've written. Nitrates and phosphates are absorbed by producers. Now I've written this because in the question it says that there is a high primary productivity, so there is a high amount of producers in coastal waters. So the fact that high amounts of nitrates and phosphates are absorbed by producers means that there are more producers, as they can survive better due to the presence of nitrates and phosphates. The producers are food sources. This means that there are more fish, as there are more food sources available to them. So I've written the nitrates and phosphates are absorbed by producers, which means that there are more producers which are food sources, so there are more fish. So let's look at the mark scheme. So the first marking point says nitrate / phosphate / named ions / nutrients for growth of or absorbed or used by plants or algal producers. We wrote they are absorbed by producers, so we would get that mark. So the second marking point says more producers / consumers, or food sources, so more fish. As the word so is written in bold here, you need to make that connection to more fish. Or you can write fish reproduce more, or fish grow more, or fish move to the area, so they move to the coastal waters. It says here also that you must have an idea of more plants related to some increase in fish. So you need to have this kind of idea to get the marks. So we will get both marks, as we wrote both of these points correctly. Right, that is all I want to say for this video. Thank you very, very much for watching. If you have any queries or questions at all, please leave them in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to answer them, and I'll see you in the next video.